All right, everybody. Well, it's just a couple minutes past 4, so I think it would be good to go ahead and get started. And while, let's see, so if you could mute yourselves, everybody, that would be helpful. That can help the audio of the person who will be presenting in just a minute, and that's our author, Sally Svenson. So there's the mute button there in the left of your, at the bottom left, and you can tap that. And okay, so I guess I'll go ahead and get started. I'm Amy Catania. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Saranac Lake. We're at the Saranac Laboratory Museum in Saranac Lake. We welcome you to come visit us when we will be reopening very soon. As the snow starts to melt, we look forward to reopening the museum. And we're open usually year round from 10 to 5, Tuesday through Saturday. That's our typical schedule. So stay tuned for news about our reopening. We are also underway with a major project to expand the museum, as many of you know. So we are expanding into the Trudeau building next door to become a 2-building campus that interprets the rich history of the Saranac Lake region and, of course, the history of Trudeau and tuberculosis in Saranac Lake. So it's an exciting project. We welcome you to ask questions, get involved, tell us your ideas for the new museum. And we will be breaking ground and going out to bid on the first phase, the exterior construction, in just the next month or so. So very exciting times at Historic Saranac Lake. Many of you already know all that because you're members of HSL. So thank you for supporting us. You know, your membership support makes all the difference in the world and helps support all the great programs at Historic Saranac Lake. This program is being recorded today, so I just wanted to let everybody know that. And we will be sharing the recording later online, and with folks that are interested in hearing it later. So I think I've said everything I need to say. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. So Sally Svenson is author of Blacks in the Adirondacks. She's been writing about the Adirondack region for more than 15 years. She's the author of Adirondack Churches, A History of Design and Building, which was published in 2006. Ms. Svenson is a graduate of Cornell University. She holds master's degrees from Columbia University and Columbia Teachers College. She resides in New York City and is a summer resident in the Adirondacks. She serves on the board of Adirondack Experience, the museum at Blue Mountain Lake, and we are proud to count Sally as a longstanding member of Historic Saranac Lake. So thank you, Sally, for making time to speak with us today about your book, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sally.
Thank you, Amy. It does seem like more than 2.5 years ago since I first talked about this book at an historic Saranac Lake meeting, just 8 months after its publication. Since then, the increased visibility and popularity of the Black Lives Matter movement has changed the conversation about racism in this country, and a few regional incidents have affected local perceptions. Neither realignment, however, has changed the pre-1950 history of Blacks in the region, or particularly in this microregion that I set about to research and record some 10 years ago. I was lucky to have the help of 2 wonderful local residents in my Saranac Lake research. First, Amy's first slide, please. Alice Delaire Wareham, whom probably many of you knew, who was born in the 1920s. This is Alice at the age of 6 with the Black couple who lived in her home and worked for her parents, George and Zoe Tyre. She was great about sharing stories about them, including some problems that they had with various parts of family life. And she loaned me this slide to make a copy of. She died not long after the book was published in 2018. Another one who was really helpful was Basil Johnson Sr., whom some of you may know. He lived in Bloomingdale. He was born in Saranac Lake, also in the 20s, and died after the book again was published just last September. My interest in the Adirondack Black history was piqued when I was scrolling through microfilm copies of the Lake George Mirror from the 1890s in the New York Public Library. This was before it came online with the New York historic newspapers. I was looking for references to a totally different subject, in fact, boathouse design, which is very far from the topic. but was fascinated by the regularly occurring articles I came upon about Black waitstaffs at Lake George's two largest hotels and at the Hotel Champlain just south of Plattsburgh. I was also taken by articles about Black students from Southern industrial schools who passed regularly through the region on fundraising tours for their institutions, stopping in 1901 at Saranac Lake's Algonquin Hotel and the Saranac Inn. I began making copies of these articles and filing them away. My file grew over the next couple of years, and I finally decided that there was actually a lot to write about on the subject of Blacks in the Adirondacks. I defined my area of research for practical reasons to the Adirondack Park. Names were important in discovering individual histories, and I'm sure you know, detailed census records are not released until 72 years after the census itself has taken place for privacy reasons. So the 1940 census was made public in 2012, and that enabled me to get started. I found that almost nothing had been written about Blacks in the region, although they had been quietly present throughout its recorded history. There were an estimated 400 slaves scattered about the region in the late 18th century, most of whom drifted away after slavery was abolished. While it's hard to estimate numbers, looking at statistics for the two counties wholly in the park gives some idea of numbers in the mid-19th century. Essex County, more developed than many Adirondack areas, reported 50 African Americans in its overall population, slightly over 31,000 in 1850. Hamilton County counted 2 in its population of 2,188. As an example of the short shrift given to Blacks in early histories, I have to mention a publication by Barbara McMartin, a respected author who wrote 25 books about the Adirondacks. Her 1976 book, Caroga, an Adirondack town recalls its past, related the history of the Fulton County community of Caroga, which comprised around 600 residents and with which her family had a long connection. The book featured an 1856 property map bearing the name of all of the town's owners, and prominently displayed among them were the names of 3 Black families living on adjacent farms. These families sent 5 soldiers to the Civil War between them, and only 2 of them came home. Yet there was not a single word in McMartin's book about these families. And it was 30 years later, when the second edition was published, that they received some mention in the foreword to the book. I just thought that was kind of an amazing piece of history. Saranac Lake, I was surprised to discover, had perhaps the richest Black history of all Adirondack communities. Its Black population was the largest, as well as the most diverse. In the region during the early decades of the 20th century, a number of families that were related to original Garrett Smith settlers who settled in Vermontville and Bloomingdale came to town as laborers. They worked as not only as laborers, but also as teamsters. Their wives, who didn't really have much opportunity to take free time after they were married, tended to work in laundries. Okay. I'm gonna skip that. The best known, okay, I'll skip that. Local people were not, however, the only members of Saranac Lake's resident Black population. African-American tuberculosis sufferers came too. They were not welcome at the Trudeau Sanitarium, nor were they accepted at most of the village's private cure cottages. But over time, several Black entrepreneurs tried their hand at running cottages catering specifically to Black patients. 2 women were particularly successful in doing so. Viola Ramsey, who married a Saranac Lake chauffeur in 1922, opened a cottage facility for TB patients and other guests on Lake Flower Avenue in 1923. Amy, picture, please. This is the cottage recently, whether it's, I'm not quite sure what the year is, but it's still on Lake Flower Avenue, still has its cure porch. She and her husband built the building themselves. So Viola's sister-in-law, Maddie Ramsey Reed, relocated from New York City to Saranac Lake and opened a cottage at 155 Pine Street in 1927. Some of Saranac Lake's Black TB patients were well known in the communities from which they came. One of them, slide please, Hunter C. Haynes, had made money with his invention of a razor strop, for which he profitably sold the patent and pursued a subsequent career as a movie producer. He died several months after arriving in the village in 1917. Bud Aiken, a 30-year-old trombonist and cornetist in a band with which Louis Armstrong also played, arrived in town after money was raised by his friends to pay his expenses while he sought a cure. He arrived, however, with a far advanced case of disease and died just a week after settling into Mattie Reed's cottage in 1927. William Alphaeus Hunton, slide. This is a slide from the University of Minnesota's YMCA collection. Hunton, the international secretary of the YMCA, lived with his wife and 10-year-old son in a private cure cottage for 17 months in 1914-15. Hunton's son, Alphaeus Jr., attended public school in Saranac Lake, went on to graduate from Harvard University, and became a widely known political activist on behalf of his race. His father died a year after leaving Saranac Lake. The National Vaudeville Artists Association's TB facility, later Will Rogers, opened in 1929. It accommodated several colorful Black patients associated with the entertainment world over the years. Among them was Bill Bailey, tap dancing brother of Pearl Bailey and the first known performer of the moonwalk, made famous by Michael Jackson.
That's one of my girl names.
Moonwalk, which he called a backslide. So anyway, it's on YouTube if you want to feel it with all the music. I'm very fond of it. But anyway, Saranac Lake can claim Bill Bailey as a resident, at least at one time. Saranac Lake's population peaked around 1930, when it stood at 8,220. The Depression damped the boom that had propelled the village's growth, as did the decreasing business in tuberculosis, which was becoming better understood as a disease and for which other treatments than sanatorium cases care were being introduced. Violet Ramsey and Mattie Reed both ran their cottages into the late 1930s, when Viola Ramsey converted her facility into a tourist home for Black guests. Mattie Reed left the business altogether and spent the rest of her working life as a live-out housekeeper. One wonders how Blacks were treated as members of the Saranac Lake village community. Frederick Douglass, the renowned 19th century Black spokesman and social reformer, described what he saw as the relationship between Blacks and whites as follows, quote, "Here at the North, our white friends, not our friends, but our fellow citizens, have a regard for us, like us very well in our places, and they have selected our places for us, and they have marked out the boundary lines for us. And while we remain in the narrow circumference they describe for us, we are good fellows, and they pat us on the head and say we are good boys," close quote. It appears that that was pretty much the position that Blacks held in Saranac Lake in the first half of the 20th century. An article in the Adirondack Enterprise, I thought, demonstrated the relationship pretty succinctly. Before I move on to it, though, I have to give a little bit of background. The article refers to the Saranac Lake Day Nursery, a daycare program for working parents. I guess we have a slide here. I will go on talking. A daycare program for working parents founded in 1919 by theatrical agent William Morris, who cured in the village and later bought a summer home here. The article also mentions a cakewalk. This was a high-stepping competitive exhibition dance popular at the end of the 19th century. It was often performed in Black minstrel shows by couples in fancy dress, either in processionals or in the round, and a cake was awarded to the winning couple at the end of the performance. The dance is thought to have had its roots in slavery, where it was performed for the entertainment of plantation owners at harvest time. It appears that children in Saranac Lake's Black demographic were welcome to participate in the nursery program, but their parents were not invited to the annual summer benefits held on its behalf. In 1923, though, the enterprise reported that the nursery's white patrons were organizing a special dance for what they termed the dusky hued, so that, quote, colored folk, close quote, colored folk, close quote, might, through their purchase of tickets, quote, cooperate with the community in aiding the enterprise, which has helped them, close quote. The evening program featured a cakewalk and a prize cup for the couple judged by their white host to have executed it in the most correct manner. How do you think the paying guests must have felt at this Shades of the Plantation evening? I find it all kind of appalling. Surprisingly, although all of its Black residents would be considered by occupation to be members of the working class, a distinctive, self-identifying Black middle class developed in Saranac Lake. It was the only such Black community to be found in all of the Adirondacks, and was made up primarily of domestic servants who worked full-time for wealthy residents and enjoyed titles of butler, cook, and maid. A few TB patients were welcomed into the group if they felt up to it. This kind of restrictive social grouping represented what E. Franklin Fraser, a leading Black sociologist of the 1940s and 50s, considered a typical pattern of escape from racial isolation from members of the Black bourgeoisie. They tried hard to imitate white society in their standards of consumption and recreation. Their flight into what Fraser characterized as a make-believe world had, he noted, little basis in the American economic system and was difficult to pull off with what could be squeezed out of the meager earnings of Black workers. Like its equivalents elsewhere, Saranac Lake's Black middle class occasionally submitted its social news to African-American newspapers in New York City and as far afield as Baltimore, Norfolk, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The pieces recorded parties, vacation trips, marriages, visits from out-of-town guests, and the health status of TB patients. Names of hosts at individual events were scrupulously noted, as were their addresses, particularly if they were fashionable ones, which generally meant those of affluent white employers in whose homes domestic servants lived. I thought I would read a few abbreviated postings covering particularly festive events in order to give some idea of this aspect of Black life in Saranac Lake. The first of the write-ups from February 1914 comes from New York City's New York Age, a Black newspaper. Quote, Mr. and Mrs. Warren Poyas will give a social tea and dance for a few of their friends on Thursday evening at their residence, 41 Pine Street. A July 1950 article, also from New York Age, refers to the Rockledge Social Club, which I assume was made up of the 4 Black servants then working in the Rockledge neighborhood home of civil engineer G. Peyton Clark. It was worded, quote, the Rockledge Social Club gave an excursion Monday, July 5, up Saranac Lake to Underwater Mountain Camp and was served with dinner at Hotel Colba. In the evening, a full dress reception was given by the club at Mount Baker Hall, which was beautifully decorated for the occasion. The reception was well attended. Dancing lasted until 3 o'clock. Music by Willis Hayward's orchestra of 9 pieces. In July 1931, New York's Amsterdam News, another African-American paper, offered the following at Saranac Lake News, quote, Mr. and Mrs. R.H. Watson entertained the Ladies Club and the Nonsuch Goodfellows at a supper and barn dance the other evening. Mrs. George Tyre, the woman who worked for Alice Wareham's parents, entertained a few friends at bridge. And then there's this tiny Saranac Lake item from the Baltimore African-American of February 22, 1936. Mrs. Queenie Davis, who's buried in Saranac Lake Cemetery, Mrs. Queenie Davis has returned after spending 10 days in New York and Washington, D.C., close quote. Tourism gained momentum in the early 20th century, and Black as well as white travelers took to the road. However, as Crisis, the magazine of the National Association for Colored People, reminded its readers in 1912, a white tourist, quote, may choose from 1,000 different places the one to which he will go with his family. Excuse me. But you, if you are colored, will knock in vain at the farmhouse door for board and lodging. The beautiful, inexpensive, out-of-the-way places are out of your way indeed, close quote. In 1936, excuse me, water. In 1936, a new guidebook was introduced and officially called the Negro Motorist Green Book and popularly known as the Green Book. Its aim was to keep the Black tourist, quote, from running into difficulties, embarrassments, and to make his trip more enjoyable, close quote. In 1938, the first year that the publication began coverage of nationwide facilities of every kind, from hotels to garages to beauty parlors, a single listing was included for Saranac Lake. This was for the boarding house of Mrs. V. Ramsey, one of those two early Cure Cottage proprietors. Her lodging, excuse me, which became the go-to accommodation for Black visitors to the village, was referred to casually by a former manager of the Hotel Saranac in recalling the segregationist attitude of local hoteliers in the early 1940s. In these years, she wrote, quote, we as a nation were still practicing race discrimination. At the hotel, and I am sure at other public places, it was the practice as guests were registering to tactfully suggest that the Black maid or chauffeur might be more comfortable at the tourist home on Lake Flower Avenue that was operated by Black people. This was acceptable and was routine, close quote. The Hotel Saranac, to its credit, reversed its race policy in the late 1940s and one of the earliest and most consistent advertisers in another guide for Black tourists, Travel Guide, first published in 1948 with the motto, quote, vacation and recreation without humiliation, close quote, Keogh's Motel on Lake Flower Avenue, where Mackenzie's Grill is now, advertised in Travel Guide in 1955. When another of the directions in which my research took me, I was surprised to become a Pullman porter who had unusual and close ties to the village. This was W.J. Grandy, who was assigned for some 20 years to a regular train run between New York City and Saranac Lake before his death in 1922. In his obituary, which appeared in an African-American paper in New York City, he was remembered for the unusual patience, tact, and sympathy he showed to the often severely ill TB patients, most of them white, who traveled by train to and from the village. It was recalled of Grandy that he, quote, would handle an invalid with such ease and solicitude that a professional nurse could not have done better. Many times, passengers who knew him would delay their trip if he were not on the job. Not that they would not get service, but they felt they were in care of a friend when he was in attendance, close quote. Saranac Lake sent several Black soldiers to World War I, but a 1918 article in Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP, noted that the town was, quote, not as appreciative of her colored soldiers as in some other cities, close quote. It pointed out that while 2 Black men were sent off to war from the village, carrying a gift of 2 or 3 boxes of cigarettes and matches, a single white man who followed them 2 days later was presented, quote, with a trunk full of all sorts of things and also full military honors consisting of a company of home guards and the firing off of a couple of rounds of ammunition, close quote. Wallace Minifield, whose parents settled in Vermontville around 1880, is listed on Saranac Lake's monument at the intersection of River and Church Streets, honoring soldiers of that war. Before I finish speaking specifically about Saranac Lake, I would like to mention an article I wrote for the New York State Archives about Blacks who are buried in Brookside Cemetery on the Bloomingdale Road between Saranac Lake and Bloomingdale. 2 sons of Avery Hazard, a Garrett Smith grantee who arrived in Bloomingdale by 1855, were among the 17 men who met in 1879 to organize the cemetery, which opened the following year. The cemetery holds the graves of many Black African Americans, a number of whom I mentioned today, and a walk through the cemetery when the weather gets a little bit nicer would be a nice, great outing. If anyone is interested in reading the article, to ask me about it afterwards because it's easy to find online. In summing up, I would say that in general, Saranac Lake did not badly in achieving a respectful relationship between its white and minority Black population. The persistence of families over several generations speaks to a level of comfort in the community. And although some of the town's Black inhabitants who now reside in Brookside and other local cemeteries spent large parts of their lives elsewhere, they also returned late in their lives to the village they still considered home. From early in the mid-20th century, longtime Black residents were recognized at their desks with full obituaries in the Adirondack Enterprise, none of which referenced race. The degree of acceptance within largely white Saranac Lake was due, according to some historians, to the fact that Blacks remained a tiny minority in town. As Ray Stannard Baker, a journalist and historian who wrote about the color line, noted in 1908, quote, "I have found no places anywhere which seem so favorable to Negroes as smaller towns and cities in the North where the colored population is not increasing," close quote. And the Black population of Saranac Lake did not increase, but decreased. Only 39 Black residents were recorded in the 1950 census of 6,900, down from those 56 Blacks in a population of not quite 5,000 in 1910. Black children raised here, like many of the offspring of the village's white parents, moved elsewhere when they were of an age to do so, generally to urban centers in search of better job opportunities and a wider life. The lack of heterogeneity of all kinds in Saranac Lake, as in the Adirondacks in general, is an ongoing problem. It's one that could have huge consequences down the road when it comes to maintaining state political support and public funding for the Adirondack Park in a changing demographic society, one that may not consider wilderness of particular importance. How to cope with racial prejudice, how to achieve greater diversity in its resident and visiting populations are questions that those who care about the region are trying to address. As of yet, I'm not aware that anyone has come up with any real answers, but I do know that residents of Saranac Lake have placed the issue firmly on its agenda. So that is the end, and I think it's now open for questions. Did we miss some slides that I didn't mention? No, we're okay. Okay, Amy, back to you.
Thank you, Sally. You know, I should have mentioned if anybody has any questions and they would like to type them in the chat box down at the bottom, that would be fine. Or we can you can turn on your microphone and ask your question. I do want to. There were a couple photos actually that I don't know if you want to talk about these, Sally, real quick, but it was the photo of the laborers at Trudeau.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's the only photograph that we have of many of the early Black residents.
Let me just
show. And there are no names attached to it. We have no idea who it is, but there they are, a couple of them. Mm-hmm. And it's surprising because some of these families that were here for generations, like Hazard and Morehouse, there are just no pictures with their names in any collections that we know of.
And there was one other picture that we recently came across in our collection.
Right, I forgot to mention it. It's the Raybrook one, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's while Trudeau never did admit Blacks, Stonewall up in Gabriel's did later into the 40s. And this is Raybrook Sanatorium, and I think it says 1947, which is obviously quite well integrated. It was not earlier, but it was by that period. So sorry, Amy, I forgot the queuing.
That's okay. And I'm going to just end before we get to the questions. While you guys are thinking about some questions to ask, I just want to show this image of your book, Sally, and give a quick plug for the book. If you haven't read it, it really is just an amazing, I mean, as you can tell by Sally's presentation, so thoroughly researched, so many wonderful details and such, you know, both the big picture, but also just these wonderful stories that you tell. And every time I go back to it, I feel like I'm sort of meeting new people that are giving me a broader picture of, you know, the past in the Adirondacks. So we are out of these copies. We sold out recently, but Chessie just placed an order and we're replenishing our copies in our museum store. So you can purchase them online and we'll, you know, let us know if you have any questions about that, but definitely a book worth having on your bookshelf.
The cover photograph, by the way, is actually of a cakewalk processional group, all dressed to the nines. They were performing at Sacandaga Park in the early 1900s, but that's a picture of which I'm quite fond. But that's the cakewalk.
Wow. So we do have a few questions here. Let's see. Info. Okay, so someone's reminding me to send out the information on the about the article that you wrote about the cemetery. Sally.
Okay, let me give it to you. It's very easy to find. If you go to New York State Archives online, New York State Archives magazine, then within that you search highlights. The piece appears as the featured article under the date Winter 2018, Volume 17, Number 3. And it's all about Brookside Cemetery.
Okay, I got as far as highlights. Could you repeat?
Okay, if you get to highlights, it's the featured article. It gives the volumes by date. So this is Winter 2018, Volume 17, Number 3. And it's labeled something to the effect of Brookside Cemetery.
Great.
And where is Brookside?
Brookside is on the road between Saranac Lake and Bloomingdale. There's that antique store that's almost to Bloomingdale on the left as you drive towards Bloomingdale.
The Red Canoe.
Shortly before that, right? Shortly before that is the cemetery. And it's a rural cemetery, but it's well populated with Black residents of Saranac Lake.
I'll be darned. I go past it all the time.
Really? Well, you should stop in. This one thing I'm sorry about. Down in the front left-hand corner as you go in, there's a whole group of people that's related to the Hazard family, in the middle of which is a white obelisk, which was I've forgotten the generation, but he was kind of the progenitor, or at least responsible for all of the rest of the Hazards around. And a relative of his several years ago had the marble obelisk cleaned, and it removed almost all of the lettering.
Oh,
That's
oh,
really sad. I mean, it happens with old sort of soft marble. But hopefully somewhere there's a photograph of it. The Bloomingdale Historical Society may have one. But he's surrounded by relatives, including, I assume, no, I shouldn't say that. Sorry. It's about a resident who was perhaps buried there not long ago, but whose family lives in Saranac Lake and may not be interested in having the name mentioned.
So Sally, we have some good questions coming in here, and if you would like to look in the chat box, you'll see them there, or I can read them out to you. The first one that I see here is from your husband's cousin, Mark.
I was going to say, not my husband, my God.
Not your husband, but Mark, his cousin. He said, could Sally please speak for a minute or two about the Blacks who made the annual pilgrimages to John Brown's grave in North Elba?
I can, but I don't have it at the tip of my fingers. There's an entire chapter about it in the book. There were a group of Blacks who started coming up from Philadelphia in the early 1900s to celebrate John Brown at his home every May, just before the real tourist season started. And they continued into the 1970s. And it was a fascinating group, a fascinating organization. There's a lot of material about them in the records next to the John Brown house in the manager's group. But yeah, I can't jump on that right away, Mark. I have to go back and review it, and I haven't. So, sorry.
Thank you.
You're just trying to embarrass me. And the next.
That was a good summary. So John asks two questions. Prior to the abolishment of slavery, what churches in the Adirondacks, in terms of their denomination, were heavily involved in the abolition movement? And related to that, following slavery in the 20th century, which churches were Blacks most heavily involved in?
Again, I have to think about this. They were probably the most likely to be members of the Methodist Church. Was just kind of the common denominator of middle-class church, and that was their choice. Before the 20th century, there were not that many Black churches, or not that many churches in the Adirondacks. Certainly in the early, Plattsburgh is the only one that comes to mind that had definite pro-abolitionists and anti-abolitionists that sort of recognize one another through their churches. But again, there's a chapter that mentions that in the book. Mm-hmm. So go back and reread it, Mark.
Well, that was actually not Mark asking that question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was. No. The second question. Okay. Oh, that's John. Sorry.
And are you seeing there, Sally, underneath the next question here from Chris to everyone? Would you consider the Black farm owners in Timbuktu who got land from Gerrit Smith to be middle class since they were property owners who could vote? How were they treated?
There's some question about that, because theoretically you needed to have more in property than their land was valued at, which was around $50 in the early censuses of 1850 and 1860. But Amy Godine, who was researched a lot of Black history, said that somehow the state didn't really seem to care if you had $200 worth of property. If you had $50, that was fine with them. So I would assume that they were considered middle class, but so few of them lasted for very long that it was not really it was not an ongoing settlement for long at all. So it doesn't really get as much credit as it should as an original community, but it was pretty much disappeared. The only one who was just, only one or two people stayed on from that group and the rest just moved on very quickly.
Mhm.
How do you explain that?
I think it was poorly thought out. There was no money given to maintain people while they were starting to farm this land. It was just virgin forest. And it's hard to come and spend the 2 or 3 years settling down and building a farm for yourself without some income. And that probably should have been part of the original consideration. It was not. And I think also a lot of the land that they received was not really agricultural land. Some of it apparently was located in lakes, et cetera, and on mountainsides. It was just kind of took and divided plats on his property, and what you got was what you got. So many, many people who were given plots of land in his various communities didn't even take them up. It was just kind of, they went into the lottery, won something, and then said, eh. So I mean, it's hard to explain. I mean, it's hard to understand, but I think that a lot of it was just the business of not being able to afford to stay there.
And where did most of these folks come from?
A lot came from Rensselaer County, Lewis County, New York City. It was sort of a generalized group that accepted the invitation to come and join them. Again, it's all in the book, in the chapter about them.
Yeah, I'm kind of guessing that.
I keep going back to that.
I'm kind of guessing that their expectations were very different from what they found, and that they thought they were, going to have a very different kind of a life than they had in the city or wherever they came from, and it was just that much. It was just terribly difficult.
There was also a local historian at the time who wrote about them, and he was not very welcoming and suggested that the community itself was not terribly welcoming. And they weren't really interested in selling to Blacks. They really thought that they were had just been foisted upon them, and why are we being responsible for this group? So that's perhaps another reason. It was again, a larger community than was something that locals would be comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
That's all guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Sally, someone asks a question. Do you know if there was a substantial population of Black people who worked at the, and I can never say this, so forgive me, Tahawas mine?
I've never read about any there, no. The only really industrial community that developed was in Mariah and around mining, but I have not seen any at Tahawas.
Okay. Was there a Black community on Chiota as well? And there's that term for the brook that goes from Chiota. Well, it doesn't go from Chiota.
Not that I've heard of. The only way that I could find people was through the census.
Okay.
And then through newspapers. And it was just kind of keywording various possibilities that would come up with these names. But I probably did not, for example, research Chiota itself for Black census residents, but I just kind of worked around and kind of found out what I could come up with. But Chiota was not on my list.
But the story connected to the term that was used, the derogatory term, N-word term for the river.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, but it could have just been a derogatory term that someone felt like using. I don't know.
I feel like I've read so many different stories connected to that, and I'm not sure which are true or not. And then, of course, the memory starts to fail, and it all turns into a mush in my brain. But it would be good to sort of, it's something to research for sure. Probably somebody on this call knows something about that.
I'm sure I did research it I just never turned up anything that made a connection.
Interesting. And one person was interested in the issue of the Hotel Saranac opening their doors then to Blacks, I think you said in the 1940s, and was that something that was affordable would have been affordable to many people in the Black community at that time?
It depends on who was traveling. I would imagine there were definitely middle class Blacks on the road, and it probably would have.
Yep.
Nobody else?
Chat seems to be turned off, at least from my end.
Indeed, yes.
That's
Do you have
interesting.
another question, Mark?
I was just going to send a quick note that, of course, as you know, Sally and Amy and many others here, in my area, which is southeast St. Lawrence County, we had a very active mining community at Benson Mines. But I have never found any records or any notes of there having been any Blacks that worked at the mines over the years from the 1800s into the 1970s.
No, I don't think so. Mariah was a very big thing, and there were a lot of families that came up from South Carolina. It all started actually with something that was anti-labor, and they were allowing unions to come in, and this was something that the iron industry in Port Henry jumped right on because they didn't want any union workers, and they knew that Blacks had long been anti-union, and they were willing to come and take jobs that Black union members were not willing to take. And this was what started it. And then it grew as a community, and it was a huge community. And Alice Payton Green, who wrote the afterword to my book, was the daughter of a miner in Mariah. And she had a lot of stories to tell. And her father's relatives were there. And it was through a relative of her father's that the family got there in the first place. So that was the only really other large resident community in the Adirondacks. Lake George for years had a summer resident colony, mostly of waiters working in the hotels. And that was another really active part of that's, as I said, that's what got me started on this, because there were probably maybe 600 Blacks between the two large hotels that had Black wait staffs on Lake George, and then the Lake Champlain, Hotel Champlain had another 300 a year. So, and that was simply a summer colony. And I think in 1910, there was not, maybe there were 2 Black families along Lake George, but that was it. So Saranac Lake should be very proud of itself. It has the most vivid Black history of any place in the region.
Do you remember researching, Sally, or turning up in your research, and it could be in the book and I'm just not remembering, Black staff at the Saranac Inn?
No.
That ring a bell? Okay.
Not at all.
I recently was telling me that there was one of the buildings on the Saranac Inn property was for Black hotel staff, and that
I would doubt it. They never had a wait staff. All of these, a lot of hotels had like Black bell captains or Black people, porters, that kind of thing, opening doors, etc.
Okay.
But never to the degree that Lake George had, where they were really much an important part of its industrial group.
Interesting. So it might have been a residence for Black staff that weren't waiters, but they might have been, other workers.
I haven't heard of it. Not that that means anything. No.
Something to look into, I guess.
So the number you were talking about in Lake George was 600 at one time?
Yes.
Wow.
So because the Saranac, what was it? The Sagamore had a Black wait staff. The Fort William Henry had a Black wait staff, both into almost 1900. And then there were 300 at the Hotel Champlain. And so it was a huge number.
A couple more questions, Sally, and then we'll let everybody go because it's getting close to dinner time, at least here on the East Coast. But was Bill Bailey that you spoke of the one who was in the song "Won't You Come Home, Bill Bailey"?
I don't know. I didn't track that. I was more interested in the Cabin in the Sky, which is where he first did his moonwalk.
Well, maybe we can Google that and find out. It sounds like
I'm sure you can.
And then someone asked, were Blacks involved in the reconstruction of Fort Ticonderoga?
Again, I didn't read anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, I'm excited to finish the book.
Oh, good.
And I really have enjoyed as far as I've gotten. And again, I'll say that because I have a home in Vermontville, it was just really fun to learn how much activity there had been in Vermontville. And sad, of course, that folks weren't able to stay longer, but it's nice to know the history, and I'm definitely going to go check out that cemetery.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, it's well worth the trip.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sally. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. This was wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Nice to see your faces and hope to see everybody again soon. Please do stay tuned for a link to this presentation. Order the book if you like. We expect them to be coming in the next couple weeks, and more presentations on the way, so stay tuned. We hope to see you soon this summer. Come back and see us.